Hello. Last week I talked about some of the books that I read in the past that have scared me, but confession, the scariest part of my reading life is my TBR, as I think most of you can probably relate to. However, we are solidly in the fourth quarter of the reading year, which is hard to fathom, I recognize, because I'm having trouble fathoming it. However, that also means that the Goodreads Choice Awards is going to drop early to mid-November, earlier than I am emotionally prepared for. And that means I still have tons and tons of books to read this year. And in the past, historically, I have often found myself kind of going into a reading slump about this time of year. And I think this year I maybe have finally pinned down why that is. I really do think it has something to do with just how many books are coming out in this time, like September through the end of the year in terms of that fall pub push, as well as kind of looking at the mountain of titles released earlier in the year that I just haven't gotten to yet and being kind of overwhelmed by it all. So I'm really working to push through that this year and just read what I can. But that being said, I have a lot of books I want to read and I'm not going to be able to get to them all before the end of the year. And this is where you come in, ideally, in that I'm going to show some of the books and talk about some of the books that are still on my more immediate TBR, but more immediate TBR is still too big of a pile to really pin down. So my ask is, if you have experience with any of these books, whether you would highly recommend them and think I need to push them to the top of my list, or if you think that I should avoid and just kind of push it to the bottom of the pile, I would really appreciate you sharing that information because we've got a lot to go through, and it's further exacerbated by the fact that I am a mood reader. And even amidst that, I feel like I really haven't settled in to my usual kind of October themed reading, probably partly because I have been relying more on the library this year, and they're a little bit more behind on processing some of the more atmospheric fall reads that I put on hold. That being said, also, this video needs to be a safe space for just how many books I have checked out of the library. I promise I take books back to the library promptly when they are requested. That being said, Chicago does have a pretty generous loan limit. So all that being said, let's look at some of these books and you give me your thoughts. The first one I still want to read this year is kind of one of the exceptions to the rule in that it's not a 2023 release. And I'm not saying that I only want to read 2023 releases, but I definitely do kind of want to focus on that through the release of the Goodreads Choice Awards so I can make the most informed voting decision possible. You know, because the Goodreads Choice Awards mean so much, but I kind of like the game of, especially in the genres that I read in a little bit more, like how many of these have I read? That being said, I do still want to read Heart of the Sun Warrior by Sue Lynn Tan, probably in December. Daughter of the Moon Goddess was one of my favorite reads last year, as you well know if you have spent the year with me, and if you have, thank you. So I have been meaning to read the sequel. I bought it last year, but it was part of the HarperCollins strike, so I didn't want to read it when I couldn't talk about it, and then it just got shuffled down. So I need to read this, and I also need to read A Fire Endless by Rebecca Ross, the sequel to A River Enchanted, which was also one of my favorites from last year, that both were HarperCollins titles whose release fell during the strike. So still definitely on my list. I haven't forgotten about this book. And then a book I absolutely intended to get from the library, The Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff. And then I went to an event at the Newberry Library that was a conversation between Lauren Groff and Rebecca Mackay. And of course, by the rules of the universe, the day I went to that was also the day my hold for this book finally came in after a decent wait for it to get processed because I was in that first hold round. So I, of course, couldn't pass up getting this signed, especially as I was supposed to go to her Chicago event for Matrix last year, and I was really excited about it, and then the event was canceled. So I have not read this book yet. It is supposed to be in conversation with Matrix in the sense that they are both historical novels that are kind of like tracing a thought in terms of worldview, but not connected in a real tangible way. This is supposed to be, from what I've gathered, a little bit of man versus nature or girl versus nature, which isn't something I generally consider myself drawn to, but I am very intrigued by how Lauren Groff is going to attack this. Also, it doesn't look particularly long, and between that and Groff's use of language, I am very, very excited to see what the shape of this is going to be, especially having heard her talk a little bit more immediately about her writing process. I have heard her writing process discussed discussed in the past, but never while in her presence. So that was a lot of fun. I'm definitely still interested in talking about this for a future Friday, but I was also very excited to talk about Matrix last year, and it didn't seem like a whole lot of other people were as interested in talking about that book as I was. So I don't know, I guess we'll see if I read this, what kind of conversations it sparks. I also will be very interested to kind of see, by nature of it being so focused on the wilds, the eponymous wilds, if it's in conversation thematically with Birnam Wood, just because, you know, that's another book I read this year. So it's on the list. I will also be interested if this is nominated for a Goodreads Choice Award. I'm guessing if it is, it will be classified as historical fiction, not literary fiction, but I will be interested to see if it's nominated at all, I guess. And then continuing the trend of authors I've seen in conversation, which has been more than the past couple of years this year, but not as many as I would like ideally or feel like I went to in the past. But Madalena and the Dark by Julia Fine, I am always fascinated by Fine's use, the kind of blurring of the lines in her novels. There's always some element of the odd going on. I talked about The Upstairs House when it came out at her book tour stop at Women and Children First. I was able to ask a question regarding this kind of use of the odd in her books and how she kind of finds that in her writing process, because it's definitely something that has drawn me to her work since What Should Be Wild, which I do need to get my hands on. I will say I was disappointed that they didn't have any of that in stock for the signing. They had The Upstairs House, but I already have a signed copy of that because when that book was released, there were no book stops happening, but she did go sign stock at the neighboring stores and I had a copy pre-ordered, and so she very kindly, I think, personalized that copy. Can confirm she personalized my pre-order, which was just such a nice thing to do amidst everything. So I'm very excited about this one because it is set, I want to say 1700s? 1717 in Venice, and it follows like two young women in a music school, obsession, music, female friendship, and she described it as inspired by Olivia Rodrigo, so that conjures a very exciting, pulsating energy. It's also exciting for me as a reader because all of her books have been so different and yet united in this commonality of having this weird element, even though the weird element is also incredibly different in all of her books. So this one has been higher on my list, especially because like the tone and the atmosphere and that sense of danger that I get just from how it's been talked about seem like they would be perfect for this time of year. But again, if you've read this and have thoughts, feel free to weigh in. Also high on the atmospheric list and popular right now, Rouge by Mona Awad, and this in particular because I've read Natural Beauty, because I've read The Glow. I've also still been interested in Goddess by Deborah Hemming, despite it having kind of lackluster reviews right now, because it also seems to be kind of tackling this idea of beauty culture, also tangential, but not something I foresee myself getting to this year. Wellness by Nathan Hill has been getting a lot of buzz and seems to be living in a similar realm, though from a very different angle. This one I'm expecting to live potentially most closely to Natural Beauty, which I really did enjoy. And I've really loved this exploration of like beauty culture, kind of testing the waters of where like online discourse kind of seeps into this and creating these paradigms. And I'm just very excited to see what the author of Bunny does for that conversation, or how she kind of twists that in weird ways. That being said, I also still have her release from last year that I purchased that I also need to read, but I feel like this one is probably more pressing, and I anticipate that this will be nominated for a Goodreads Choice Award based on just how popular it is. So I definitely probably need to jump on this one for sure. Staying in this realm of seasonally appropriate reads, I've been meaning to read Delicious Monsters by Lizelle Sambury since it came out in February. I haven't had this copy since it came out in February, to be clear, but it seems like the time to read it. And it is a dual timeline, dual POV in some ways, to my understanding, kind of haunted house book. And also just look at this cover. Like, this is gorgeous and also slightly threatening, which is perfect for this season. It is a little chunkier, but honestly, this is the book this Halloween season that I have just been looking at on the shelf like, ooh, I really want to sink my teeth into that. So maybe this will just be my Halloween treat to myself. If you read this, I am incredibly interested. I know I say that and I mean it for every book, but I really want to hear stuff about this book because I haven't heard a whole lot about it and it looks so good. And then we have Wayward by Amelia Hart, which came out earlier this year, but even when it came out, it felt a little bit more like a fall book to me. But this, to my understanding, weaves together 3 stories in 3 separate times and also has an element of exploration of witchcraft. So it has a contemporary storyline, a World War II storyline, and a 17th century witch hunt storyline to my comprehension, which are two very popular eras for historical exploration. I personally am more attracted to the 17th century than to the World War II, but I know many people will be the opposite or both. So I am very interested to see what this is. I feel like I've seen a lot of good buzz about it, particularly on Litsy, but don't quote me on that. Continuing in this realm, I'm clearly attracted to the atmospheric, to the gothic, to the slightly dark, all times of year, but this is going to be a bit of a twofer because we've got Scarlet by Genevieve Cogman, which is a vampire reimagining of the Scarlet Pimpernel, and to fully appreciate this, I feel like I need to reread the Scarlet Pimpernel. So I will need to reread this book, which I do love and is very short comparably, to understand the kind of full breadth of how this is being reinterpreted. I really just kind of need to refamiliarize myself with the cast of characters outside of Percy and Marguerite. That being said, I don't know that Scarlet is a beat for beat reimagining. It feels like it introduces an original character, but I just feel like I kind of need to revisit the source material to appreciate what's going on there. Then continuing in that realm of books released earlier this year that really feel perfect for fall, The God of Endings by Jacqueline Holland. This talks about a woman who works at like a private school in the 80s, but she has endured for centuries. So my mind, that has not read any spoilers about this book, immediately thinks vampire. Or it's something a little bit more Addie LaRue-esque, but it seems to be a little bit more on the literary side of that. I anticipate the tone, the voice, feeling a little bit more like Addie LaRue or maybe Erin Morgenstern, but I could be absolutely full of it, and I will only know if I, one, read it, or two, you tell me otherwise. So I am excited. Again, this one is a little thicker and I anticipate it moving a little slower. Actually, revisiting the blurb, I'm becoming more confident in the vampire because of this line: the return of a stalking presence from her past and her own mysteriously growing hunger for blood. So maybe she doesn't know she's a vampire, but I'm pretty sure she's probably a vampire. Following in that vein, I still want to read Blood Debts by Terry J. Benton Walker. This just seems like it's going to be a really fun YA historical fantasy with some New Orleans flavor, and I remain excited to read this one. Additionally, not a new release this year, but a re-release by a major publisher, to my understanding. I still haven't read any Olivia Blake, which I bought a copy of the Atlas 6 at Indie Bookstore Day like 2 years ago, but I digress. I want to read Masters of Death. It seems fun. To my comprehension of the blurb, it seems like it has a haunted house at the center, a kind of eclectic group of characters, and I'm assuming a little bit of romance, or maybe a lot of romance. You let me know. So definitely have this on my radar. Probably admittedly more of a summer book, but there is also that darkness and danger still lurking. I still want to read Sing Me to Sleep by Gabby Burton. It's mermaids or sirens, but even more dangerous, amped up, a little bit more established of a fantasy world. It's not like mermaids established in our human realm as I understand it. Also, there's a map. So that tells me it's a little bit more high fantasy because map. I'm interested in that kind of like darker mermaid. It made me think maybe of To Kill a Kingdom, which I really enjoyed. So interested in diving into this one and finding out more. The pun came to me in the moment. I couldn't deny it. I apologize. A book that came on my radar a little later because we do have some surprise entries here. Confidence by Raphael Frumpkin, because this, I have been told, is a little bit kind of like exploring a scam, maybe a little MLM adjacent or full-blown MLM, I don't know. Actually, the mini blurb here gives us a great idea. Best friends and occasional lovers, Ezra and Orson are teetering on the top of the world after founding a company that promises instant enlightenment in this thrilling queer caper about scams, schemes, and the absurdity of the American dream. This sounds like an utter delight. I need to get to this. Also, The New Life by Tom Crew. This is a historical fiction about gay men at the end of the 19th century. So it's very much seemingly an exploration of these characters' lives, but also kind of looking in to moving into the 20th century and just the kind of social landscape. I love historical fiction in this vein, even if I haven't been reading in it as deeply as I have in the past recently. Also, I won this in a Goodreads giveaway, and I need to read it because I have no data to prove this at all, but I'm convinced that you have a better shot of winning Goodreads giveaways in the future if you have actually read the books and reviewed them in the past. I need to speed this up, so let's go. The Adventures of Amina El-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. This is a pirate book. I love pirate books, and I definitely want to get this read this year. One, because it's incredibly popular this year, and I read Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea this year, and I think that they are probably in really interesting conversation with each other. So I want to read this while I am still close enough to that book to be able to kind of consider them in conversation with each other, while obviously they are vastly different projects, independent books. I just think it would be fun to see kind of what themes kind of pop out of both of them and if there are any commonalities. I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself by Marissa Crane. This I actually bought off of a TikTok recommendation earlier this year because the hold list was just way too long, and then it's been just sitting on my shelf. But it is supposedly about a world in which if you are convicted of a crime, you gain a shadow. And so what this kind of physical reminder of a crime means, I anticipate this being an interesting thematic conversation with Chain Gang All-Stars, because they both seem to be kind of analyzing the criminal justice system in very different ways, but from really unique and inventive angles. Then Flux by Jin Woo Chang, because I haven't read enough science fiction this year, and this seems like it is going to be exploring alternate dimensions, and I'm very interested in that exploration, though I would like to remind everyone that alternate dimension exploration is vastly different than time travel. I only say this because of the coverage of dark matter back in the day. Just a reminder, that is interdimensional, not time travel. Listen, it's important to me for stupid reasons, I recognize that, but it is important. But speaking of interdimensional, I also need to read Bridge by Lauren Bukes. I did not read her last release, but I was obsessed with her in the early mid-2010s, basically Shining Girls, Broken Monsters era. Her short story collection was incredibly interesting and kept me kind of engaged in that kind of interim where I was craving a new novel that dealt with something weird, and this presumably deals with something weird. So I'm very excited to see what this is going to be, and she always has an element of danger or darkness that is kind of lurking in the background, so I definitely foresee this being perfect for late fall as we're kind of moving out of the Halloween season where we want the kind of more immediate haunts. This, I'm guessing, has a little bit more tension and anticipation. As you surely know by now, I love a story in the Psyche and Eros family, so I need to read Psyche and Eros by Luna McNamara. It feels like we're getting more direct interpretations of the Psyche and Eros story, which I am very excited for, and remain excited about this, even if it is still on my TBR. And then another book I definitely bought because I saw it on TikTok and the wait time was too long, Ripe by Sarah Rose Etter. This, I am very intrigued by the type of storytelling, but as the last line of the blurb says, Ripe portrays one millennial woman's journey through our late capitalist hellscape and offers a brilliantly incisive look at the absurdities of modern life. And I've heard through other readers' interactions with this book that there is like a cloud that kind of follows her, and I'm very intrigued by the odd and the absurd, and it also looks like it is going to be playing with structure in an inventive way, which is also something I'm very interested in, and it looks like a quick read. That being said, I did not check the pile correctly. This was not the book on top of the pile, but I checked the corners and missed the side. So this is your friendly reminder to also check the bottom of a book. Is it the end of the world? Absolutely not. But you know, just a friendly PSA. Can you believe I actually thought this would be a short video? Pressing on, another book that came onto my radar later, The Human Origins of Beatrice Porter and Other Essential Ghosts by Soraya Palmer. This looks, well, I was immediately attracted to other essential ghosts in the title, as I think most of us would be, but also in reading the blurb, I got the kind of sense that it might fill a similar spot in my reading life that Vagabonds filled, and as you well know, Vagabonds was one of my favorite books of last year. I adore that book. While I don't think that this is going to be told in a more short story type format, I definitely get a sense of that kind of like blurring of realms, of the story almost being told as a tale. So I am intrigued by this one for sure. Then we have Half-Life of a Stolen Sister by Rachel Cantor. I like the Brontes. This explores the Brontes, but through string theory. I mean, I don't know for sure it's through string theory, but I know it plays with form and there are strings on the cover. So what would you think? I'm clearly losing it a little bit here, and I apologize. Next, we have another book that wasn't immediately on my radar earlier this year, Empty Theater by Jack Jemk. Obviously, there is a longer title here that I'm not going to even try, but this is historical fiction, but it seems like it takes a kind of comedic voice, a little satirical, a little odd, and I'm very intrigued by that kind of satirical and odd tone within historical fiction. I'm not sure if this will be in the same vein as something like Little by Edward Carey and ideally Edith Haller by Edward Carey, which I do have on hold at the library and is still part of this ongoing TBR, but this explores King Ludwig II of Bavaria and Empress Elizabeth of Austria, or Empress Sisi, which is admittedly as much of that history as I'm really familiar with, so I am interested to explore it further through this book. Because we haven't had enough fairies this year, and this isn't even the only fairy book remaining on my TBR, The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill by Rowena Miller. This I bought during Indie Bookstore Day, and I definitely feel like I should read at least a couple of the books I bought on Indie Bookstore Day yet this year, and this follows two sisters and a fairy bargain. But I do foresee this digging into potentially some darker subject matter. I believe they are making this deal because of some abuse from one of the sisters' husbands. And then moving into some lighter territory, there are still so many romances I want to read this year, including Much Ado About Nada by Uzma Jalaluddin, who wrote one of my favorites, Aisha at Last, one of my favorite Pride and Prejudice retellings for certain. So I'm very interested in her next book because I also loved Hana Khan Carries On. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I picked this up on Jalaluddin's name alone, so I'm going to be going in with no real expectations on what exactly we're digging into here. I'm sure I talked about it in anticipated releases video, so I have read the blurb, but I don't remember enough tangible details, and I am fine with going in kind of being surprised. A romance I'm anticipating that isn't going to be as much of a surprise is Tastes Like Shocker by Nisha Sharma, because this is the sequel to Dating Dr. Dill, and this is a Shakespearean retelling series, and this is our Much Ado About Nothing book. I'm very interested to see what this is going to be. Dating Dr. Dill was so much fun, and it changed a lot of the beats of the source material, really made it its own, especially because you kind of have to, in my opinion, to turn The Taming of the Shrew into a romance, because as I discussed in that Feature Friday, the ending of that play, I don't think, is super kind to Kate. But this is Much Ado About Nothing, which oddly enough from college through adulthood has become one of the plays I've interacted with more than I expected I would, so I am definitely up for a fun retelling. How I got ink on my copy of the book, I don't know, but it's okay because it is my copy. And then a book that actually kind of surprised me when I picked it up at the library, because I had been waiting for the US release of this book since the UK release of this book, which was back at the beginning of the year, because I remember being worried about the HarperCollins strike in relation to this book, which gives you some perspective, though it definitely feels like we have lived 100 years since then in some ways. But Godkiller by Hannah Kaner, because like, look at, I was expecting this to be a chunker, and it is much shorter than I anticipated, but it involves a quest and a world in which the gods interact with mortals, and presumably, if we go by the title, a character who kills gods. So I definitely got a sense of like Lanny Taylor from this. I'm not saying it's going to be like that, but it sparked a similar interest in me and felt in a similar vein, and I will be interested to see if the voice feels in a similar world as well, though it is very hard to match Lanny Taylor's voice. Then another historical romance, Verity and the Forbidden Suitor by J.J. McAvoy. I will also need to go and read Aphrodite and the Duke, because that's the first in the series, but I do believe I have a digital copy of that book. I picked this up at the last chapter bookstore opening, so they were out of the first one if they had it in stock, so I will just need to get that read so I can get this read, but it looks like a lot of fun. And then not a 2023 release, but remains pertinent to things happening at the end of the year that I had hoped we would get to talk about on this channel, but it's looking like the studios aren't bargaining in good faith with actors, so we probably won't get to. But I'm finally going to read my copy of The Buccaneers by Edith Wharton. I've been holding on to this. I bought this in like 2015, 2016, but I've left this and Custom of the Country as like two Edith Whartons that I haven't read yet, so I can go to when I need that kind of fresh Edith Wharton fix. books. Listen, it doesn't make sense, I get it, but I truly love Edith Wharton despite not having read her entire body of work, and this is her unfinished work. So I will be very interested to see where this stands against the work I have read, most notably The Age of Innocence, House of Mirth, and Ethan Frome. But yeah, Edith Wharton thoughts. Now, those were just my physical books. I feel like I haven't bought as many ebooks this year, partly because not as many 2023 releases have gone on sale this year, I feel like, at least that I've caught, as 2022 releases did last year. Now maybe they'll start coming out a little bit more fast and furious these last 3 months because we're in that final quarter, that final push, but we'll see. The first book that I bought for the year I had pre-ordered, I don't think I have talked about this year because it came out during the HarperCollins strike and it was an Avon title. That book is The Duke Gets Even by Joanna Shupe. I love Joanna Shupe. She's one of my auto-read historical romance authors, and this is the finale of a series. And as is common in finales, we've been kind of teasing this character for 3 previous books. So our eponymous Duke has basically come in contact with all of our heroines in this series, and he's either been straight up jilted or he is kind of like starting to court them and they become much more interested in their respective love interest. But he's also just kind of been hanging in the background with this other character that's been kind of hanging in the background. And there was always kind of a sense being teased very purposefully that there was something going on between these two. So I want to read about the something going on between these two. Next, we have another book that I do think came out during the HarperCollins strike, but I can't fully remember, Unseelie by Evelise Hausman. So this is another book of the Fae, but I think all of the fairy books, at least that I've read this year, have had very specific, distinct angles and points of view, and this one follows 2 sisters, but according to the blurb in this book, one of the sisters is an autistic changeling, and the link between autism and stories of changelings is an interesting one, and I'm very interested to see how this book is going to explore that. Moving on, a book I had already forgotten I got on sale this year, Flower Heart by Catherine Blakewell. We did talk about this in an anticipated, but it is a young adult fantasy. The cover is giving Howl's Moving Castle to me for some reason, but the blurb compares it to Margaret Rogerson and Tamora Pierce. I like all of those things, so I'm interested in giving it a go. I also did pick up Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld on sale. I have reservations about this one, admittedly. One, I have heard from other reviewers that it is told in 3 big chunks, 3 big parts, and that those aren't broken up into distinct chapters. I also heard her speak at Printers Row Lit Fest, and I was kind of unsure about that talk. I did have a coworker who attended the same conversation and absolutely loved it. I do admit that I was going in with some biases, because one, her last book that I remember was Rodham, which felt like it was kind of like a blurry ethical line for me because it was kind of an alternate universe exploration of Hillary Rodham Clinton, who is a living public figure, and it just felt like real person fan fiction to me in a way that for some reason just didn't sit well, and probably a grudge that I've been carrying for too long and it's been kind of muddled in my own mind. When she released her Pride and Prejudice retelling Eligible, the way she was talking about that book on the kind of release circuit at the time really read to me as if she thought she was kind of like coming in and doing this revolutionary thing, and Pride and Prejudice has been retold. It was being retold at the time by even a couple other authors, and she seemed to be approaching it as if it was incredibly novel. And it just read to me in a similar way to when people come into the romance community and think that they are revolutionizing it in a way that like looks down on the work that already exists. And actually that ties in to her talk because this is titled Romantic Comedy, and it didn't seem within the conversation as if she had a real firm grasp on the genre of romantic comedy, or it was something that she was particularly interested in exploring. I have a couple notes in my phone for my book club to talk about at lunch after this talk because we were attending it together, and I have 2 questions written down. Do we think this is romantic, and do we think this is funny? And one of the things that I found incredibly telling in the conversation around this book is she kept saying her character is perceived as funny, because being funny and being perceived as funny feel like 2 distinct things to me, but let me know if you have a different read on that. And it also just frustrated me, probably because I was already coming in with this baggage of how she talked about the Pride and Prejudice retelling, at least to my perception, and then it felt like there wasn't much respect for the existing romantic comedy work that is already out there. And because this was kind of pitched as a romantic comedy, but also was very much being billed as literary fiction, that it somehow had like a higher value because of that in the perception of the conversation. Again, I could be bringing all of my own baggage to that, but that's just kind of how I perceived it. And as someone who reads both romance and literary fiction pretty widely, I would say, I mean, not the widest, but at least pretty respectably, it just felt like kind of a reductive conversation. Sorry for the tangent, but I meant to be able to talk about that together, and I just haven't had another opportunity to. So if you've read this book, because it has been pretty popular, I would be very interested in your thoughts on it, and I want it to be good. I do want to be clear about that, and I'm very aware of the baggage I'm bringing in, which I think will help me be more aware of it and how it's impacting my reading of the book if it does. I also picked up on sale The Things We Do to Our Friends by Heather Darwent, which I believe is supposed to be almost kind of like a dark academia, kind of a look at an insular group of friends, and maybe there's more going on there as they kind of encourage behavior in each other that may not be the best. So that may be a good fall read as well. I also picked up Piñata by Leopoldo Gaut, which I definitely need to get read before the end of this month. I'm also still reading The Haunting of Alejandra, which I also need to get read before the end of this month, or at least, you know, before the end of fall. They feel like very scary fall books. And then more lightning round, because we will have talked about these books more recently, but believe it or not, despite all of the books I have out from the library, they do still let me put holds on books, and these are the books that I currently have on hold, and I'm waiting mostly for them to be processed. But The Voice Upstairs by Laura Weymouth, Curious Tides by Pascal Lassalle, The Square of Sevens by Laura Shepard Robinson, which I saw while book shopping at the bookseller, and that is all I really remember. The Spirit Bears Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White, The Glutton by A.K. Blackmore, The Death I Gave Him by M.X. Liu, The Reformatory by Tananarive Due, A Haunting on the Hill by Elizabeth Hand, Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. Some of these are digital, some of these are physical also. Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead, and an audiobook, Sure, I'll Join Your Cult by Maria Bamford. And all of this has very much made me reconsider using my birthday to justify a book haul, even if the odds are decent that I would have just bought books I already have on hold, so I didn't have to continue to wait on the hold list. And I do have a coupon, because who do we think I am? But maybe we just use those birthday justification funds somewhere else. So with all of that, I need you. Help me focus my fourth quarter reading here. What have you read that you really think I should read? What maybe haven't you read but you're really interested in and want us to have a conversation about, so want me to prioritize? What have you already read and maybe didn't so much love, so think I should just put to the side for now? I'm being completely serious when I ask for your opinions here, because clearly I've got a lot of books to get through before the end of the year. So let me know what you're thinking, and thanks for hanging out while I kind of assess and get my head on straight for this fourth quarter reading here. But as always, thank you for hanging out. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. We've all got a lot of reading to do before the end of the year. And yeah, bye.